So for those in the audience who may only know Charles Dickens as the person who wrote the story that A Muppet Christmas Carol is based on, or that, Oliver Twist is the person that said, "Please, sir, I want some more." Could you tell us a bit more about Dickens and who he was?
Well, that's a great start. He was what I love most about Dickens is I really do think he's one of the best writers from the 19th century and really of all time. I think he's a fantastic storyteller, and that's the reason I think his novels, more than most others, have really lived on. Those stories are still with us, like A Christmas Carol, which has been reinvented in so many different ways and continues to be reinvented. But he's a complicated man, which I'm sure we'll get into. But he was always, his novels are so much about, I don't know, looking out for the underdog, for,
Hmm.
trying to appeal to people's sympathy, to get them to care about their fellow creatures and about these important social issues. And that's what I love about Dickens, that he does. I tend to like dark Dickens, which is post 1850. So you cited Oliver Twist and Christmas Carol. Those are all like early, I say, schmaltzy Dickens, when he's most sentimental. He becomes much more cynical later in life, which is when I like him.
Ah,
But, all of his books, the short stories, the novels, even his magazines that he edited, I think are always interested in the human condition and really trying to get people to think about each other and to have sympathy.
You mentioned like he changed throughout his career, like knowing that I was reading about it earlier that he wrote A Christmas Carol when he was like 30. It's like younger than I am now. I feel like such a
yeah.
failure in life, knowing that he achieved such success.
I hear you. Well, he was already a best-selling novelist in his like mid-20s.
That's so crazy.
That, yeah.
So we've spoken on the show a little bit about like literacy rates through history and how like pulp fiction and popular fiction sort of increases over time. In the case of Dickens, he's right smack in the middle of the 19th century, where like we entered with like 50% literacy and ended with like 90, depending on who you ask. So he's like
Hmm.
right in the middle of that. Um, who is Dickens writing for, and more broadly, who's consuming his novels at that time?
It's actually kind of a complicated question. That he writes for a middle class audience. That he's definitely a middle class author who has middle class values, and his prose is sophisticated enough that it would be, not as accessible to people with a pretty low literacy level, like the working classes. And so his primary readers are the middle class, I think. Middle class is upper class. But a lot of people consumed Dickens in ways other than reading his novels. And so he has this much
Sure.
broader audience that comes from stage adaptations of people who would go to the theater and see all unauthorized versions of Dickens's novels on stage. They would read these knockoffs, that there's tons of working class versions of Dickens's novels, things like Oliver
Really.
Twist and the Penny Pickwick. And so a
Hmm.
lot of people come to Dickens and are huge fans without ever having read actual Dickens. And that's how he gets this really broad appeal. But we best know, we still, through school primarily, through college, through middle school, through high school, when Dickens is still taught, we still primarily read middle class fiction from the 19th century. And so that's how I think he's largely lived on. But it was his kind of unauthorized versions that really broadened his appeal in the 19th century.
When people think about a novel today, they usually think about like a single book, like a volume that you pick up and you read together, like not in one sitting per
Hmm.
se, but like uh, but at the time, is it correct to say that most of his novels were serializations?
Yes, all of his novels were serialized. And we have little things like A Christmas Carol, which isn't a novel. It's I don't know what we would call it, a novella probably,
Right.
but they don't really have a term for it in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
But all of his novels were serialized. And this is what makes Dickens an extraordinary writer, in my view. I always talk about him whenever I teach the 19th century or teach the Victorian period because of what he does to the form of the novel. Accidentally, incidentally enough, that Pickwick Papers, which is what he was hired for originally, he was just like this kid, right? He's in his early 20s. And as they do today, right, they're going to hire some kid to just do something no one cares about, which was to write copy for these illustrations that were done by an actual famous illustrator.
Right.
And so he was hired to do that. And the famous story goes that that illustrator actually committed suicide after, I think it was the second number. And so Dickens was this kid that no one had heard of, was left with this subscription. People had subscribed to these installments, mainly for the illustrations. And so they're like, well, crap, we have this thing that people are expecting. What do we do with it? And Dickens had already tried to shift it in a different direction. And then he just ran with that. And turns out he was extremely talented, right? And so people fell in love with Pickwick Papers. It's his first novel, but it didn't start out as a novel. And it's a fascinating text. It's a tough text. Most people do not read Pickwick Papers today. But you can actually see it become a novel as it progresses through the installments, that it suddenly has a real plot. It has characters that develop. And so but because it was in those installments, this wasn't new, that we had done kind of serialized narratives back in the 18th century, but this was such a smashing success made this a really lucrative publishing endeavor. So these little they're not published as volumes, so these little paper, I wish I would have brought mine, I would have shown you guys, my little paper segments of installations, and they were cheap, extremely cheap to publish. And so cheap installments for a broad audience meant lots of money for the publishers. So part of this is economic. But what's extraordinary about Dickens is that he was the master of this form, and it was an extremely stressful form to write in. So all but 3 of his novels were monthlies. So there would be a monthly installment that you would subscribe to. And most of them go across about 14 months. And that's why all of his novels are exactly the same length, that they are meant to, that each installment was a specific number of pages. So you probably heard the rumor in high school, like, Dickens, the novels are so long because he got paid by the word. That's the equivalent of saying that TV writers today are paid by the minute. Well, sort of, right?
Yeah.
But the TV episodes have to be, like 43 minutes or, 57 minutes on HBO or these various different lengths. And so that's what Dickens was doing, was writing to the installment or the parameters. But what makes him remarkable, and if you read any of his long novels, I hope that, listeners out there will appreciate this, that he did most of them with pretty much like a bare bones outline. And when you're serializing, you can't go back and edit. So the characters that you start out with, like, that's what you're stuck with for the next 14 months. And so he was able to do this, and this is all handwritten too. Remember, there's no delete, there's no copy and paste, that there are no typewriters, that he was able to write to the specific length each month. He almost never underwrote or overwrote a number piece. And to keep control of these massive stories with, some of them have, I think, close to 100 characters, and not screw up.
Wow. That's really remarkable. Impressive.
Yeah,
it really is.
And 100 characters to keep them all in your head, right? Keep them all straight. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. And if you read, he has 3 weeklies, and weeklies were even more stressful because then you have to really do these short segments. But you may have been forced to suffer through Great Expectations in high school, which just breaks my heart. I wish no one would teach it in high school because it's such a great novel, and 16-year-olds just can't appreciate it.
Sure.
But that was a weekly, and that one he did really with no outline. That it's a perfectly structured novel, and it's remarkable that it was written the way that it was. But that was one of his late novels, so he was really good at that point. But yeah, that's how novels were consumed. And I always tell my students, like, don't feel bad if you are, feeling really stressed trying to read 100 pages at a time. Like, that was never what these novels were meant for. They
Right.
were television shows. They
Yeah.
were the 19th century, version of TV. So you'd have to wait for traditional TV before Netflix binging,
Sure.
where you would have to wait for each segment to come out.
I think our audience probably can relate. Comic books are monthly to this day, so even like graphic novels came out, once a month and in given size and things like that. And I can't imagine doing weekly. There are occasionally comic books that release weekly these days, but often they have multiple writers because that is quite a lot to keep up with.
Oh, it totally is. And it was extremely stressful. And Dickens was a workaholic, and he would often have multiple projects going on at once. In fact, A Christmas Carol was written in 6 weeks. And he did it while he was writing one of his serial novels, Martin Chuzzlewit. And there's a good reason that you have never heard of that novel, because it was a flop. It was really a hard time in Dickens's life. But he was so good at staying on top of everything. He didn't sleep, like, literally. And he was an incredible guy in that respect.
Wow. Oh, well, and then yeah. Well, I'm also thinking about like the number of characters you have to keep straight, and if you're doing multiple books at the same time, or works, you have to keep them all straight that way too. I can barely keep like my coworkers straight. That's crazy, right?
Right? I know. And he just, he almost never messes up. And if you read other serial novelists from the 19th century, and almost all 19th century novels are either published in volume form, 3 volumes, or serialized. So many other novelists make mistakes that they suddenly forget a character's name and start calling them something else halfway through. Or there's like plot lines that go nowhere, and you're like, wait a minute, what happened to so-and-so? But never Dickens.
It's like recasting without ever acknowledging the change. That's
Totally.
good. Okay, so help us understand how big Dickens was at the time. I read a presumably apocryphal story that when he passed away, a young girl said something like, "What's next? Will Father Christmas die?" So, I mean, he must be big, since the term like Dickensian came directly from his name and influence. So who would you compare him to today in his fame, his influence, stuff like that? How big was he?
He was really big. Like, he was a major celebrity that everyone had heard of. I was really trying to think about this, what parallels. And the issue is that our culture right now has become so fractured. I think that even, for those of us who are old enough, like growing up in the 80s or the 90s, where everyone was watching the same TV shows, like that, there was a much more centralized culture. But, it's like probably like, if someone hadn't heard of Beyonce, like, who hasn't heard of Beyonce anywhere in the world? Like, everyone knows her. Or Taylor Swift, right?
Sure.
That level of celebrity. But as far as like being universally beloved, I was trying to think. I was like, Dolly Parton, right? We would all be so sad if Dolly Parton died. That she has like not just like people don't love her so much because of her music, but because of like what she stands for,
Her
and
character,
who she is.
yeah.
Absolutely. And Dickens had this highly cultivated and very controlled image that he had propagated. He was a very successful sort of propagandist for his own kind of persona and lifestyle that he kept in the public eye. And that kept him pretty universally beloved by, especially English and American culture, but also European culture. He was big abroad as well. And so like his death was this huge thing that struck everybody, which is what that story is from. And so that is accurate. Like losing him was like losing this national treasure. And but it was definitely a reputation that he helped build. Like if Dickens were alive today, he would totally be on social media, and I think he'd be a master of like constructing this persona, like Taylor Swift. Maybe Dickens and Taylor Swift have a lot in common.
There you go.